Hello, I'm Clive Coldwell from AV Magazine, and welcome to our latest webinar. Today, we're looking at some of the technology advancements in enterprise streaming and digital signage over the last 2 years. We're also going to take a look at the market changes that have driven these advancements and what they mean for the future. My guests who are getting into the meat of this with me are Tim Sullivan from Advanced Media Technologies, talking about who's buying what, where, and why. Bill Hughes, Director of Product Management at Amino Communications, who'll be talking about making digital signage easy. And Silverco's Brian Crotaz, who built his first TV studio in 1993 and installed his first digital signage screen in 1998. He's won 2 awards for his signage projects and designed systems for banks, retailers, factories, airports, and stadiums. Quite a busy guy. So let's start with you, Tim, if we may. The pretty obvious question: what does a digital signage customer look like these days?
Well, they're varying from everything from what you can imagine in hospitality and sports venues to things you wouldn't really expect. Government agencies, city, county, state, federal, and even military for different purposes, for informational, for directional. Airports are very popular with for directional signage. And then we're starting to see small business use the same as large business. So you could imagine a large tower building and enterprise type facility that would need directional signage for meetings, announcements, emergency notifications. But then we're also seeing that even in small offices, 10, 15 people, just a welcoming thing. So it's varying across the whole enterprise market.
What kind of features do they look for in their digital signage? Is it pretty predictable stuff, or are there any sort of unusual requirements?
Well, it can be unusual where you need to involve a heavy middleware type partner or digital signage integration type company, or it can be very simple as meeting room one is for ABC, meeting room two is 1, 2, 3. But then we can also see the need for scrolls with updated weather information. Changes on the fly are the biggest thing. Is so you can imagine at a sports venue, if you run out of hot dogs, well, we're going to pull that off the menu really quick. Things like that. So those are some of the more unique, customized requests that we're seeing.
So you can really create some incredibly responsive systems. I think people will realize it's a bit static and not quite as
Sure,
dynamic as probably it needs to be in a real business environment.
absolutely, absolutely.
How important is, back to an odd one, how important is time to market? And by that I mean ease of integration, deployment, and access. Are
Well,
those
right
quite
now,
complex steps?
yeah, right now it's a lot more challenging than what it was maybe 2, 3 years ago with product availability. That's one of the things that is key to work with a integrator and the distribution partner all the way back to the manufacturer to have that plan in place. And that's something we've done quite a good job on over the last couple of years is planning out not just what we need next month and 6 months, but what we're going to need a year out. So forecasting is really important in working with our partners to make sure that we're going to have product when people need to deploy. So one of the things that we've done is looked at when projects need to be on air, if you will, or when they're going to start integration, when they're going to start building. So if we're looking at a large venue, when it's concrete's being poured, we're probably making sure that product's on order and going to be ready for them 6 to 8 to 12 months out.
And that's the golden chestnut at the moment, isn't it? Global
Yeah,
supply chain issues. I mean, not just for you, of course. It's pretty major, affecting everybody as far as all my conversations I've been having. Um, what effect is this having on their choices?
so yeah, the choices are limited, and it's causing customers to have to maybe change midstream, if you will. So they go in thinking we're going to want this, and then all of a sudden we need something different. It's not so much anymore MPEG 2 and MPEG 4 content. It's now 4K content. We're going to have 4K. So do we have a box that's going to support that type of digital signage and video in 4K and eventually move into those larger things? But the other thing that is causing that is, yes, the manufacturers are now getting chips, and yes, they can build product, but can it get shipped here into the States or internationally in a timely fashion? And right now, that's a difficult challenge. The supply chain delays, you could walk across the Pacific on all the ships that are sitting out there off the coast. So, yeah, we see that as a major reason for people changing midstream, going in thinking of one and moving to another.
Yeah, we saw the maps of the ships a few days ago. It's quite mind-boggling, actually, how many are out
Yes.
there.
Yes.
I mean, it's an interesting time, isn't it? Because it's supply chain is sort of coinciding with people's requirements getting more complex, wanting more and more sophisticated stuff, high res, and clever stuff they want to show on their systems. So instead of a just basic supply, they're also actually adding to those problems by actually wanting to have, really more sophisticated stuff as well, which is probably, you need a crystal ball to sort of plan that one out, don't you?
Yeah. I mean, that would be the reason to have a crystal ball at this time. We've worked with a few manufacturers that have given demo and product information to us early on, and midstream or a few months in, they're having to do changes and making sure that those chips that they've got will support the upgrades. And that's one of the things, we bring things into our lab and test it. So we try to break it. And then our customers do an even better job of trying to break it. So they'll throw something at us that we're not ready for, or, oh, this doesn't do this. They want to really customize stuff. And that's not always easy, but luckily we work with some really great partners.
Well, you can't have an easy life, Tim. It's got to be a bit demanding,
Yeah.
So what sort of recommendations are you giving to companies seeking digital signage solutions? I mean, complex or simple?
Well, we try to keep it as simple as we can. I mean, people always throw the complex in there. We keep it very simple. Of work with a strategic partner. Got to share a slide here. I'd like to share for a moment. So what we're seeing is getting a little trouble here with the delay. So if you can see my slide now. So the features and performance of a product is number one. What are you looking for, and what do we have that supports that? Reliability. So that's another major thing. What's the mean time between failures? Is it a product that we've known, and is there technical support there for it, both in-house for us, if you're working with a digital signage company in between, or a middleware company, you want to make sure they can support you. And the big question right now is availability and logistics. What kind of timeline is it? Is your partner planning out in real time what they're looking at for a few years down the road? So that's the biggest thing that we're seeing in a situation like that.
How long do you think this global supply chain thing is going to last for? A couple of years?
Yeah, we're not seeing anything turn around quickly. We are seeing improvements, but we're not seeing. We're planning out things for 2 years from now, not just 6 months or 12 months. We're actually placing orders for products that we won't see for a year. And so that's something that we're gambling on a little bit, if you want to call it that. but we know the need's going to be there.
Okay, well, thanks very much for that, Tim. We can wing it out to Bill Hughes. Hello, Bill. If I can come to you next, how did next generation digital signage solutions make it easier for customers to share audio, video, and graphics on screens? That's a loaded question for you.
Yeah, there's a lot of things we can talk about, I think, in here, but I'll focus on the three that I think are the most important or have made the most advances that we've seen from our end. And I think the first one that always comes to mind is this standardization that we're seeing around the operating systems that are now being used within digital signage. And along with that, the application framework. So if you go back to previous generations of digital signage, a company like us would say, what do we need in order to provide a solution to our customers? So we would go out, we would take a base OS, we would then find all of the best software components that we can. So we'd be taking a web browser, a media player, DRM components, networking stack, and put that all together, wrap it up with some APIs, and then provide that to our customers, who would then build digital signage solutions against our APIs. In that ecosystem, there's a lot of back and forth between a company like us and how do we use the APIs. There's a lot of bug fixing. There's a lot on kind of our shoulders to maintain the security updates and make sure that all the bugs are getting fixed and features are being driven through the product. And on the developer side, they're spending a lot of time getting used to the APIs, asking for the requests, waiting for when they're going to be available. And then they've got one set of APIs for us that are bespoke, right? And if they go to a different vendor, then they've got a different set. Nowadays, you've got this great standardization where an OS comes packed with all of those components that are pre-tested. They've been designed specifically for a purpose. And there's an application framework that comes along with this to build applications on top of it. So anybody these days that can develop a mobile application, for example, can now develop a digital signage solution. And that has really opened up the market to so many more players, which is good for everyone. On the other side of it, on our side of it, it means that we're no longer spending time, bug fixing, or we're spending a lot less time bug fixing and putting together these components. We're now focused on delivering much more advanced features to these customers. Things like, extreme low latency video and OpenGL support, and things that will. Sorry.
No,
things
all right.
Okay, things that will deliver a much more advanced digital signage solution to our consumers.
The moment you're sort of talking there, the first thing I think of is open standards. I suppose we take it for granted that things are open now. When you talk about APIs and everything else, I mean, clearly they matter, but it would be quite good for you to sort of state why they matter.
Yeah, so open standards are just important because it definitely takes away a lot of the things you have to worry about when you're delivering a digital signage solution. So, you're not having, as long as you're buying a device that has very good support for open standards, and you're developing your content in alignment with those open standards, then you should be able to have a very high level of confidence that your content is going to play and it's going to play correctly.
How is a device like a media player different from a PC when it comes to delivering digital signage then?
This is definitely a loaded question as well, but I'd say...
Well, they're all loaded questions.
I'd say that, a couple key things. A media right? Everything from the inputs to the PCB to the silicon that's in there is all designed for one single purpose, and that's for processing and displaying video. But if you're talking about digital signage, then you're talking about a device that even the hardware is designed for, even the mounting hardware and the chassis and everything are designed specifically for digital signage and putting it in a place where it may and ease of mounting and that. And then the software component. So if you take a PC, you better make sure that you're getting the right web browser installed, the right media player. You've got all the right licenses for DM content and all that. Whereas a media player comes prepackaged with all of this, all of these components that will make it much easier to deliver.
I think you've got a few pigeons on the line there, Bill. We're trying to rectify the line quality for you, sort of coming in a bit and out there. So, I mean, again, a bit of an obvious question, really. Is the value, you've more or less said this, but the value a media player can provide to customers deploying a digital signage solution? I mean, it's probably pretty obvious, but good to restate it, I think.
Yeah, the management piece of it actually will be showing a first version of a management solution specifically for digital signage next week at ISE. And to me, it's important because it's all about brand integrity, ensuring your displays are showing what you expect them to be displaying. And you can do that through a management system, and also making sure that firmware updates that include security updates, which is part of the brand integrity, and making sure everything is secure, is also something that you need to be paying attention to. And obviously the last one there would be simplicity. If there is a problem, being able to resolve that problem without actually walking over to a device and rebooting it. A lot of the problems we're seeing, you can solve them remotely through a management system. So I think those are the key points there.
How important is secure? I mean, it's becoming quite important when we're seeing, looking at both electronics and engineering generally across quite complex networks, and security is getting up there. Really is something of a concern. Is that a big issue in the digital signage world? Is generally speaking for everybody else?
I think it should be a concern that's on everyone's mind, to be quite honest with you. Anytime you have your brand out there in front of everyone, you want to make sure that it's a secure device with high integrity. So yeah, I definitely think, and what we're seeing is with the advancement in CMSs now that are online, more devices are online. So security is definitely becoming more and more important.
So solutions enabling, managing deployed media players, I mean, they are pretty important and incredibly valuable, aren't they?
Yeah, we think so. That's for sure. And we're seeing that our customers also think so. So there's been a great adoption of these tools and a great need for these tools as well.
How do they work? Are they straightforward? It's package functionality?
Yes, it's very straightforward. It's a graphical user interface that anyone that's used a website can use these days, and it provides super simplicity. So you get a remote control on the screen, and you get to see exactly what's on that screen, so you can click through and you can control it. Anybody that can use a remote control can use the management tools.
And is the interface getting better?
Yeah, it's getting better with each release, and a lot of feature input from our customers are driving the simplicity of use and the feature set. So yes.
Okay, super. Thanks, Bill.
Yeah.
Now then, Brian, hello.
Hello.
You're giving us a quick summary of your 24 years in digital signage, aren't you? And what changes we've seen. What place, 3 points I think you mentioned, what place do set-top boxes have in signage? How has that changed? How can we use imagination to deliver better solutions to end users? Take it away, Brian.
Let me just share my screen with you, if I can find it. It's worked a second ago. I'm just going to, there we go. Don't you love it when it works in your rehearsal and doesn't work in real life? There we are.
Well, it's the real world, Brian. Don't worry about it.
Exactly. I hate the real world. Everything works in theory, but in practice, nothing does. Yeah, so people often ask me, and they've asked me for a long time, what's the next big thing in signage? And I've pretty much given the same answer for the last 5 or 6 years. That, if I click on the right window, if you're going to ask the question, what's the next big thing? And the answer is that next big thing. The question has to be really, what's left to invent? We've got thin, flat, flexible screens. We've got sunlight readable screens. We've got transparent screens, infinitely large, seamless LED screens. We've got very small shelf edge screens. We can projection map onto 3D surfaces. Our media can be HD, 4K, 8K, even 16K resolution now. We've got film quality, real-time rendering and extended reality. We've got interactivity with gestures and multi-touch QR codes. We've got ultra-directional hypersound. We've got more data bandwidth we know what to do with. So I think we need to look at how we got here to see where we're going next. So in the 1980s, one or two signage companies around, Scala were playing signage on VHS tapes, controlled over a 1200 baud modem. In the 90s, we were playing it out from £1,000 computers with slow remote uploads, maybe 8 kilobit, 16 kilobit if you're really lucky. And I was designing tape playout systems for Discovery and Disney, and later putting screens into estate agents and theatres at the end of the 90s. In those days, a 42-inch screen was £20,000. It was only the very biggest companies with the deepest pockets and the biggest return on investment that could afford a signage system. In the 2000s, we get the large format screens, the plasma screens turned to LCD at sensible prices. We got 5 or 6 signage companies in each of the larger countries. I founded Inspiration Matters, which AMX bought in 2007, developing real-time rendered PC-based digital signage, still sort of £1,000 PCs behind every screen. Then in the 2010s, we start to see set-top boxes that are capable of very simple digital signage, Raspberry Pi, etc., that could play out HD at very low cost, and broadband was here to stay. So sending large video files to site is no longer an issue. And now in the 2020s, we can do it all in 4K at low cost, with entry-level set-top boxes now capable of basic signage, and the good ones like the H200 able to perform as well as the PCs I was building 20 years ago, obviously at a much reduced price. So I've been using set-top boxes now for probably 20 years, developed my own around the Raspberry Pi when the Pi first came out, and I've seen and done most things. The hard thing for set-top boxes is playing video. Although there are standards, there are lots of choices in those standards. Video encoders have many features and controls, and there are thousands of combinations and variations in those controls. Encoders may have bugs as well, and you have no control over where that customer's file came from. Those combinations are what's hard to play back. So there are thousands of little exceptions, and your player will work until you find a file where someone's used a particular encoder in a particular way, and that one video works on their machine and doesn't work on your set-top box. And the only way to find those is to run for years, decades, and just be sent those files and have the engineers build in a workaround for each one. So that's 90% of the difficulty of set-top box, is coping with all of those little variations in video. And the top 5 vendors, the Aminos, the Bright Signs, the Xterities, the Ideas of this world, have that solved. I wouldn't trust a consumer device like a Fire Stick, though, regardless of, it's obviously a lot cheaper, but it hasn't got that decades of development behind it to be able to deal with all those video issues.
Hasn't got the robustness.
Exactly, yeah. And it will work on day one. And then your customer will send you that file that suddenly on 1,000 screens across the country doesn't work, and you're the one with the problem, not the customer for encoding it badly. So go with a trusted system. In terms of the difference in cost between a Fire Stick and a Amino set-top box, it's £100 to £200 difference in price, but as a percentage of the project cost, that's a tiny amount of money, and it's well worth stepping up that grade in the hardware you choose to make sure that you've got firmware that is really robust. The other piece that's very, very important is low power. It used to be important, now it's hyper important. Commercial power costs have gone up 43% in 10 years. So a 24/7 device now costs about £1.50 per watt per year. So a typical rollout of 1,000 H200s at 9 watts each, it's about £13,500 a year for power, compared to a NUC on the back of each screen at 45 to 60 watts. Then you're looking at 67, maybe even £90,000 a year for power. So your customer's saving £54,000 in year one just by choosing a set-top box over a PC behind the screen.
Goodness, I mean, that's not well known, is it? Do people think on those lines?
No, I know of very few people looking at it from that angle. It's something that I've been talking to customers about for around 10 years. It's gone from sort of £1 a watt to £1.50, £1.80 a watt in the last 10 years. And I think it's only going to go up from here over, especially the next 2 or 3 years, as the Russia issues kick in. Yeah. So scaling content is also important. If you're going to be running an LED screen, It's almost certainly not going to be full HD or full 4K unless you've got very deep pockets. So you're scaling your content down to a subset of the window. And I've got a little demo of this with the Five Guys image within an HDMI signal. This is where the rubber meets the road for set-top boxes. You really want to be looking at one that's got OpenGL capabilities, that can do high quality scaling within the device, because potentially each of your different sites have a slightly different size screen. Maybe it's got to fit under a doorway in a certain place, or there's a low ceiling or a particularly wide wall you're filling. And the scaling might be different on every site. And so you don't want to have to make hundreds of different versions of your video. You want the player to be able to scale it to the right size on the site, and for the engineer to be able to tweak that scaling to match the screen exactly. Now, even if you look at the top 5 set-top box vendors, they have very different ways of doing their scaling. BrightSign, for example, if you're scaling vertically, they just drop lines from the picture. So smooth lines become jagged lines. And you want to be doing testing of your set-top box to make sure that the graphics processor can do a smooth scale. Then we can start to get to the fun stuff, because we shouldn't be thinking anymore in 16:9 rectangles. Now that we have LED, we can use shapes, we can use curves, we can put them in unusual locations. We can have them facing the street up against the glass, we can have them over a lift lobby. And it's your job as the integrator, as the reseller, to think about, let's do something more than just a 16:9 rectangle on the wall. Let's make it responsive. Let's bring in data integration, interactivity, sensors, increase engagement and uplift, and increase the value to the customer of that system. And set-top boxes are really key for that, because the question is always asked, I've got a smart screen. There's a set-top box inside the screen, effectively. Why do I need a set-top box? And that's a valid question. And it's one that I've grappled with for many years. And what I've come to realize is that screens these days have a life of 10, maybe even 15 years in some cases. And the issue is there's a new model every year. So that screen you buy as you do the rollout in 5, 6, 7 years' time is not going to be the same one you bought this year. The firmware gets updated monthly, weekly sometimes. If the vendor is able to update that screen over the air, you have no control over that. And I've heard of a story in a bank where 2,000 screens went blank on a Monday morning because Samsung had updated their firmware overnight, but they hadn't told any of their software partners. So the software company gets a call Monday morning, all the screens have gone blank, it's your fault, fix it. And they've no idea what's going on. So having a set-top box on the back of the screen gives you a common platform. It means that you know that the firmware on the screen you deployed yesterday is the same firmware on the screen that you deployed 10 years ago. And that, for me, is a big tick. And I've been told off for using that image, but it's in there anyway. The final layer to think about is firmware control and remote management. Amino Orchestrate or our own DisplaySure products. When you're running devices that aren't in front of you and you can't easily get to, it's absolutely imperative you have total control of the software stack. You need to know that all the devices in the field are running exactly the same software that's on your test devices. That means you know that if the content's running on the wall in your test room, it's going to be running on the wall in your customer site, maybe even 1,000 miles away. That's very difficult on smart screens that get updated by USB sticks or have over-the-air updates from the vendor that aren't under your control. And the cost of sending an engineer to site, just getting them there, is more than the cost of a set-top box in the first place. So one visit to site pays for the set-top box on its own. So over the last 20, 25 years, we've gone from MPEG-1 to HD to 4K. Quality's gone up and prices have fallen with new technology and crossover with consumer electronics. So how do we make the technology communicate our objectives? Technology is no longer the problem. 10 years ago, it was difficult to shoehorn all the things you wanted to do into affordable technology. These days, you have to choose your vendors carefully, but the products you need are pretty much there to do anything you want. Now that the technology is democratized, much like digital photography, content creation is familiar to your users. And if you say the screen's on the tube with the ads, the screen on the bus with the ads, people know what you're talking about. And they recognize them as a screen that's like their computer monitor or home entertainment system. So there's a pool of skilled people who can create beautiful content. There's also a pool of people who think they can make beautiful content. And you need to be very careful to work with the right set of people rather than to end up with something that looks like cheap PowerPoint. So what is the next big thing? And I think it's imagination. This is the Salesforce headquarters in Fremont. Signage that interacts with its surroundings, that's been thought about. This is rendered in advance, but they've used the environment as part of that render, and it feels like there is water running down the wall. It doesn't feel like there's a screen screwed to a wall. So the key tools of imagination are creativity with a practical edge, and practicality with a creative edge. They're yin and yang, and they work together. It's no longer about a screen for a singular purpose in a place. Now we're looking at creating a device that can be updated for multiple business purposes. And the key thing is to know why you're putting it in and what that means for your creative, your integration, your data, your management even. Now that LED is affordable, we have a partner who's building several small screens a month rather than one large screen a quarter for a stadium. Even 1 square meter screens for a few £1,000s are achievable. Using them as backlights, putting them behind a wood veneer, the world is your mollusk of choice. So it's not just about running ad networks on these screens, which was always, everyone thought about making money from ads. It's now about agnostically produced user-generated content, not just in a social media term, but business user-generated content. You're not just going to your creative agency to make content. You need to empower the users to make their own. And that way it gets updated frequently. It also means you end up with a perfect placement to create greater revenue. So in the bar at a stadium, you're not just taking away the hot dogs when they've sold out, but you're showing the scores and the replays live on those screens. There is no reason for me to leave the queue to go and see what's happening in the bowl and not buy that extra hot dog. So it's about keeping people in the places you want them, making them think about the things you want them to think about. I have a lovely example of one of my colleagues who was doing a cinema screen, and the manager asked him, why can't we just have the posters back? They were so much simpler. Why do we have to have these screen menus? And there was a man standing at the till ordering. And my colleague Adrian unplugged the VGA cable from the back of the player. It shows my age. And the man stopped talking halfway through his order. And when he plugged the VGA back in, he carried on with his order. Now, if you notice, those screens never sell the small version of the meal. They only sell the large version. They are so powerful about putting an idea in your head that people will just do what they're told. Now, that might be corporate information, get your expenses in by Friday. It might be upsell in a consumer environment. We've put screens into a children's clothing retailer. We put the first screen in. We were about to go and put the second screen at the next venue when the manager phoned up the next day and said to head office, what have you done? I just sold out. And they sold a month's worth of that particular item of clothing in a day. And all they did was they put a 57-inch screen in portrait with children wearing those clothes, running around some woods, laughing. Just a locked off camera, very, very simple. But the moment that piece of clothing on a hanger became a piece of clothing on a child laughing, sales went through the roof. So imagination is really important. Imagine who will use it, not just the line manager. They won't have time, they'll get bored and it won't get changed. And then the viewer will get bored because there's nothing new on it. They know what's going to happen next. Who else in the business can manage it? Who's more invested in it? We talk about product champions. One person is the champion of upselling. Someone else probably cares more about educating. Someone else cares about directional signage. Someone else cares about safety signage, whatever it might be. Find multiple product champions and empower them through the content management system to keep those screens up to date. So the technology is only a day one problem. It's day -1 problem. From day zero of installing it, it's all about content and how that maps into the business needs.
It's interesting when you're thinking more holistically about what you're using, and bringing other lines within the company into your decision-making group. Then you've got a piece of technology which is essentially very much more strategic and as important as your legacy systems.
Yes.
I mean, imagination is just that, isn't it? I mean, digital signage was always quite an important piece of technology, but no one realized it until more or less last few years. And now it's designed to be the biggest growing area in technology over the next year or two.
Well, I've also found that the customers I've worked with who did realize 10 or 15 years ago that it was incredibly valuable to them, they wouldn't let us talk about it. We couldn't put case studies out because they didn't want their competition to know what they just found out.
Well, this is how we should be using technology, isn't it? You know,
Yeah.
to enable the business to do things it couldn't do as well as before.
Yes.
And but you know, it's a question of then who manages it. Is it
Yes.
the AV professionals? Is it IT? Is it at CIO level? I mean, you're elevating this piece of technology in its most, not from its most basic, which is as effective as it can be when working well, into a much different type of technology insofar as it affects the running of the business.
And I think one of the mistakes that we've made as an industry is we've thought about it as a technology problem. It's not, it's a content problem. The technology is just a way to get that image in someone's head up onto a wall and in front of a viewer's face. The technology is not the important part. It's the business process of deciding what to say and how you're going to say it and using the technology to do that. But the technology is a tool. It is not an end in itself. And I think we're guilty as an industry of being really excited about 4K, 8K. Frankly, the customer doesn't care. HD is plenty good enough for 99% of users. It's only the very largest screens or where the viewer can get very, very close to the screen that you'd ever notice the difference. But the difference between a cheap PowerPoint and a beautiful piece of content, or a piece of content that tells the viewer what they want, what they want to know right now, that's the real business value. I've seen systems where sales are going up 45% by putting a screen in. That's something that the salespeople kill for. You know, if they can get 2 or 3%, they're happy. But once that tech is in on day one, you've then got to empower them to put the meaningful content up in a branded way without having to go to the branding team to get that made. If you can give the salesman or the product manager branded templates where they can change the product image, they can change the price, they can change the headline text, but they can't change the font and the colors and the layout, then you can make it so much easier to make content and to get it out there quickly. And the biggest problem with screens is that you go back 5 years after having installed it and it's still running that same video that you put into the playlist on day one, and no one is looking at it because they know exactly what's going to happen on that screen next. They've seen it 1,000 times. You've got to keep that content fresh. And to do that, you've got to find those product champions within the customer's business to do that for you. Going back very briefly to set-top boxes and why they're useful, if you are looking at £1 million stadium screen and you're putting £1,000 media player behind it, that's really not an issue. You don't need to save money and go with a set-top box. But if you're building a £5,000, £10,000 screen, suddenly your PC media player is 10-15% of the cost of the system, whereas your set-top box may be only 2 or 3% of the cost of the system. So if you're going to put a media player on the back of the screen these days, it's only really the very most complicated projects where a PC makes sense. A set-top box will do 99% of what customers need. And that takes us into LED, which is the new big thing. This is an image of what's inside an LED screen. If you've never been around the back, you've got multiple power supplies there, multiple driver boards, lots of cables, lots of things that are plugged in and may not quite be pushed home. And on a hot day, they might just come off very slightly. So an LED is natively complex and unreliable. You can expect to have faults on a sort of 10-year cycle. You can expect to have several faults over that time. It might be a failed power supply, it might be a dodgy cable, it might be a fan that's failed. And obviously you're not standing in front of that screen. And if it's a roadside billboard, neither is the customer. So one of the things we're working on is remote diagnostics. So in the same way that Amino are doing Orchestrate for managing set-top boxes, we're looking at vendor agnostic diagnostics with our DisplaySure product, and we're in beta with that now. And the critical thing is, for that, we need an executable running at the back of the screen, talking to the screen. And that means that we have to be very careful which set-top box is used for media content, because you don't want to have to buy 2 boxes on the back of the screen. And what we like about the Amino product is that we can run a background service on the Android OS that doesn't do any graphics, but it sits there chattering away to the LED screen and sending all the data back up to the cloud. We don't need to have 2 boxes anymore. And again, that's reducing costs for customers. So the next big thing we think is imagination. What didn't the customer think about? It's your job as the reseller integrator to think about what else could they do with this screen? How could we make this screen more beautiful? How are they going to keep it clean? In 10 years' time, all those little fine grooves on the front are going to be full of dirt. How are you going to make sure that that doesn't happen? How are you going to keep it weatherproof? Where's the return on investment for the customer? So it's not about an amazing piece of technology. It's about something that generates ROI for the customers. This is not something that is a cost. It's something that's an investment. And if you need anyone that's been on this call, please get in touch with me if you need advice on a project. Just tell me you're on the call, and I'll give you some help on the phone if you've got any questions. And this is why the market needs consultants to help businesses bring their dreams to life. You can put them all together, but you need to make them pay, both in ROI objectives, but also customer objectives, whatever they might be, whilst protecting those expensive assets over their lifetime. And I would say to all of you, aim high, because the only limit is your imagination.
Well, that's interesting food for thought. Just to remind people watching this, by the way, if you've got any questions, do get in touch with us and ring up. A lot of things to probably sort of light people's fire there with multiple angles. We're going to be here for a while yet, but what I wanted to do was get everybody together just to ask Tim and Bill as well. Just a couple of questions about, certainly based on what we've been hearing there, what's been the most interesting challenge you've been given by the client? Tim, Bill?
Yeah, I would
whoever
say,
would like to take that one.
Yeah, sure.
No, I don't want to know.
Yeah, I'll jump into the weeds on that one. We've recently been contacted by some state legislator, and what they've got budget, so they're planning, and it was the state Senate and then the state House contacted us, and they said, okay, here's what we want to do, and here's what we want, and we're going to buy the screens. And we said, okay, well, if you're going to go that route, then here's what we recommend. But are you sure you want to go that route? Because we know you can't get the screens, but we know you can get the set-top boxes. So the change happened like instantaneously. They're like, oh, we've got budget and we have to spend it this year. I said, well, then this is what we have to do. If you want us to help you, this is what we have to do. And their mindset just changed completely, and it opened up a whole new realm of possibilities to what Brian was talking about. You can't necessarily control those screens 2 years from now, but if you want a 5-year support contract and you want us to maintain this, well, then we've got the solution for you. So we were not trying to steer them in a direction. They had a thought in mind, but we wanted to help them from our experience. So it's really that, being able to help from your experience and knowing where to kind of guide the customer if they, in spite of themselves almost. It's difficult to do, but if they're willing to listen and they trust you, that's the biggest thing.
That's key, isn't it? Trust, yeah, and having faith in what you're recommending. We're moving rapidly into a technology and services world now, and for everybody.
Right.
So I think that's probably forcing people to rethink their technology investments and what's involved with them and what they should be thinking of in 3 or 4 years' time. If you're running a business and this stuff is as strategic as we all think it is, which it is clearly, then it's a much bigger question than basic levels of technology. It's how the quality of the supplier, how you're supplying it, how you're supporting it, all these general issues that should have been question number 1 years ago, but now are much more important in the longer term decision about how to maintain and develop your systems.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think one of the things we've seen is some manufacturers, especially on the screens and TV side, because of the chip availability, they're doing a shorter run of that particular brand, and one chip may do something that another one can't. So if you're trying to make things symmetric across, all your platforms, you're trying to get your brand out there and you want it to be the same across every platform, the set top's the way to go.
That's a very good point, actually. I mean, what's the first question you should ask an end? Do you ask an end user? I mean, how do you get that sort of dialogue going, and where's your starting point?
Well, one of the things we've said is, what have you seen out there in your personal life? A lot of customers we talk to, they're like, well, I can do this on my phone. Why can't I do this? Well, it doesn't work that way when you're trying to do that for hundreds or thousands of screens. So, one of the things is, what have you seen? What do you think you want? And what do you want a year from now, 2 years from now? What is the need and the demand? And kind of having the front and the back end, we can kind of pull everything else into the middle and get some answers to them.
How is technology development going in your area, Bill? I mean, what can we sort of plan for and look for in a few years' time? Anything you can tell us that gives us a hint about where Amina's going?
Yeah, I think you'll from the first question that we talked about next gen and where are we going with that. I think as I mentioned, we're now able to spend a lot more time on unlocking the more advanced features of the silicon, and Brian mentioned a little bit about OpenGL support and Vulkan support, and one of the applications that we've just worked on with a customer. An interesting one was ultra low latency video. So it was a gaming application where, having the stream at the exact time is absolutely critical. So these are the kinds of things that, as I mentioned, with the move away from us worrying about putting all the components together, we're now more focused on unlocking those more advanced features for our customers and driving new and interesting applications in digital signage.
How very interesting. Is that a good part of the business then?
It seems to be. It's one of those things where it's a new niche, but we're definitely seeing a lot more. The more times we unlock one application, it seems like someone else says, "Hey, what if I could do this with that low latency video?" And so it starts to snowball, and then you add more features and things onto it. But it's just great that we now have the time to unlock that and spend our resources on those types of applications rather than bug fixing in the old days.
Well, that's the nature of the beast, isn't it? In the old days, we used to have good old-fashioned user groups that kept people on their toes and bringing through ideas for new features and everything else, and test them out and test bed them and everything else. And we seem to have got away from all that, really. I don't know quite whether users aren't quite as engaged as they used to be, but certainly the bigger ones who want to try it. Now we're entering this realm of new, as Brian was saying, new content, new challenges, new way of engaging people, and actually bringing them into a much more immersive world almost eventually. I think we're going to see that being from a trickle to quite a deluge of potential suggestions about what they can do with new types of applications so they can stand out and try new things.
I think that's exactly right. Yeah. And we're starting to see the fruits of some of that. And I think the reason why you're not seeing as much of the user groups in that is exactly what we talked about. There's a whole world of developers that are developing on Android systems, for example. Everybody's contributing to it. So it's not just a group of engineers that you need to keep the focus and keep pressuring them and making sure they're delivering what you want. I mean, a lot of that heavy lifting has taken off. So you've got just people now that were like Amino that are working on these advanced features, I think. So there's more of a niche there that we can focus on.
Okay, well, here's a question to everyone, really. What are the most underappreciated technology choices that are being made on new projects?
For me, it's the brackets and the cables. If you're going to go in and maintain that screen, having that ultra thin bracket that's beautiful but really hard to get at to take the screen off again if it ever goes wrong. The customers that say, well, I'd like 3 screens all fed from the same HDMI and they're 45 meters apart, but I just want to go and buy some HDMI cables on Amazon. That isn't going to work. And finding the right technology to take the signal that distance, whether it's HDBaseT or video over Cat5 or fiber, even going to SDI, which is what I do quite a lot with Blackmagic kit. there are so many different ways of doing it, and that's where it takes someone who's done it before, because they all work except in one situation, but each of those techniques has a different situation where it falls over. So you've got to look at what the customer wants to do. I remember years ago we were doing a system for the Burj Dubai, and they wanted screens in the lifts. So we said, oh, that's very simple. You just put a Wi-Fi transponder on the top of the lift, another one at the top of the shaft, and we'll put the media player on the back of the screen. Oh, no, we have to have the media player in the rack room. Well, that's okay. We'll just use an HD-based T. Yeah, but the lift shaft is 850 meters long. So we had kilometer-long HDMI cables to get into the lift shafts just because the building is so ridiculous. Yeah. That's where someone like Tim and Bill will be able to give you the right vendors and the right products to solve those interesting problems.
That's
and
then
they're not
where the value of a partner comes in, isn't it, really?
Yeah. Everyone thinks about the screen and the content. They forget about everything else.
Clive, I would say what we see is that a lot of people overlook is the support, right? We talked a little bit about PCs and general use. Yeah, I think you can throw a Raspberry Pi in there as well. And when you have a problem, who do you call if you're using a PC or a Raspberry Pi, right? So I think support is one of those features. I call it a feature because it very much is. It depends on what you're buying and who are you going to be able to pick up the phone and call, and are they going to know about your specific application and understand your needs? I think that's an important one to consider when you're choosing a solution.
Well, it's always been there. It's never really gone away, has it? But for some reason, people think differently about it according to the product, the technology they're buying. It should be something you apply to everything you're working with now, because everything's interlinked, everything's integrated. And right. You never know when you're developing something for 5 years ago how far that's going to go, and where all that work needs to be developed and updated and then spread throughout the company. I mean, nothing really nowadays is exempt because technology is so all-pervasive. And now we're going through all these massive digitization programs, as we have done for the last year or two, another year to do, especially after COVID. This is going to be the most important thing on the agenda with support and services, I would imagine.
I believe so, and we're starting to see. Tim can tell you a little bit about this, but seeing a lot of new customers come in because they're not able to get the products that they were getting from a Chinese vendor, for example. So they're coming across to get a product that someone has spent the time to make sure that the logistics are there, the support is there, and they're surprised by the amount of support. Oh, you guys are providing OS level upgrades on a yearly basis. I mean, we're still on a very old version of operating system and those kinds of things. So I think there's a lot of people that are now starting to learn because of the supply chain issues that, hey, there's much better solutions out there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that it was an older amino product that was very successful for years and years, and we still get calls for it, but it doesn't, there's none left. We've exhausted the market. We're moving on, and a lot of the support and as we were talking about with Orchestrate and having that Android operating systems and those supports, and just as something as simple as if you're doing signage and you want to have a video on the back end using just a single channel playlist. Some people can't create that, so they need someone to at least teach them for the first box, and then they can just go along with the thumb drive and do each box after that. So it's simple enough, but you have to have somebody that's done it and knows what they're doing. And the support side is big. You can't just go to YouTube and YouTube it and figure out how to set it up. I mean, that's what everybody thinks they can do, and it's not that easy.
So in sort of conclusion then, because we're running up to our time here, what are the important takeaways you want anybody watching this to take away with them, really, in a sentence or two? Tim?
Well, I think as Bill mentioned, you've got the ISE show coming up. We've got Infocom show coming up. So if you're going to be at one of those shows, I think it's important to talk to a digital signage company there that you trust. And maybe you've only seen their brand or their name out there, but just start a conversation with what you're looking for And I think they're going to help steer you in the right direction. And there's plenty of us. There's a lot of people out there, whether it's through distribution or the manufacturer or the actual digital signage, company and integrator themselves. I think you've got to have somebody that knows how to bring all those players together and get on one phone call and just kind of hash out what you want and how they can provide that for you. I think that's the biggest thing that we can do.
I'll put you on the spot later, and you'll have to give us your stand numbers. I can't remember mine for ISC before we close, so people will know where to find you. Bill, what about you?
Yeah, I would think it's just, when you're making your technology decisions, make sure that you're thinking more than just what you're trying to provide. Make sure you're thinking about how am I going to support this this ecosystem that I'm putting together. Does it have all of the support for open standards that we talked about? Is it reliable? Is it designed for a specific application that I'm trying to use it for? Is it easy to mount, as Brian said? Those kinds of things. Don't forget about the things that might be very easy to overlook. So just give it a holistic view when you're really thinking about your solution choices.
Good, Brian. Briefly,
I would say when you're choosing a vendor, choose one that has done it before, that knows what's difficult. I built a kiosk years and years ago that had to be jet washed, so it had to be completely watertight. And I went around the kiosk vendors, and all of them said, "Oh yeah, we can do that. Here's a price." And I met one who said, "Oh, that's difficult. Yeah, we'll sit you down with our designers. They're the one I picked." Find someone that obviously has thought about what you're actually asking for and can tell you, "Oh, here's the things you haven't thought about." That's the vendor to look at, and one that can talk about not just the technology, but how you're going to integrate it into the customer's business.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Tim, Bill, and Brian, thank you so much. And thank you for spending time with us today. We covered a lot of areas today, so I hope it's been a really useful one. It's been quite a while since I've talked about digital signage, so it's been a really good eye-opener for me and reassuring to know this is one of our fantastic application areas, and it's getting bigger and it's being used by everybody. It's just lovely to see that. Thank you so much for joining us. Goodbye.
Thank you, Clive.
Thanks.
Thank you.